The wind howled like a wild animal across the mountain road, and snow fell so thick that Jake Morrison could barely see 10 feet ahead of his old pickup truck. He should have turned back hours ago, but the cattle needed hay, and waiting another day wasn't an option. At 45, Jake had learned that ranch life didn't pause for bad weather. He'd been driving this same route for 20 years, ever since he'd bought the small cattle ranch after his discharge from the Army. The road twisted through pine trees and rocky cliffs, and most folks avoided it during winter storms. But Jake knew every curve, every pothole, every dangerous spot where the road got narrow. That's why the twisted metal and broken glass scattered across the asphalt caught his attention immediately. Jake slammed on his brakes, his truck sliding sideways before coming to a stop. Through the swirling snow, he could make out the dark shape of an overturned car about 50 yards down the steep embankment. The vehicle had rolled multiple times before slamming into a cluster of pine trees. "Jesus," Jake muttered, grabbing his flashlight and emergency kit from behind the seat. He half ran, half slid down the snowy slope, his boots struggling for grip on the icy ground. The car was a sedan, maybe 5 years old, completely upside down with its wheels still spinning slowly in the wind. Steam rose from the crushed hood, and Jake could smell gasoline and something else, something that made his stomach turn. The driver's side door was caved in, but Jake could see movement inside. He dropped to his knees and peered through the shattered passenger window. A man in his 30s hung upside down, held by his seatbelt. Blood covered his face and soaked his shirt, but that wasn't what made Jake's heart race. In the back seat, also hanging upside down, were 2 small children, a boy and a girl who looked like twins, maybe 6 years old. "Hey," Jake called out. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered open. He was Asian, with short black hair now matted with blood. When he saw Jake, he tried to speak, but only a wet cough came out. "Don't move," Jake said. "I'm going to get you out of there." The children were conscious but silent, their dark eyes wide with terror. The girl clutched a small stuffed rabbit while the boy held onto his sister's hand. Neither of them was bleeding badly, but they were both shaking. Whether from cold or fear, Jake couldn't tell. Jake tried the passenger door, but it wouldn't budge. He ran back to his truck and grabbed a tire iron, then smashed out more of the window glass to make the opening bigger. "I'm going to get the kids first," he told the man. But as Jake reached for the boy's seatbelt, the man grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Wait," the man whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Listen to me." Jake leaned closer. The man's breath was shallow and ragged, and Jake could see the life fading from his eyes. "These are my twins," the man said, each word an effort. "Amy and Ben. They're all I have left in this world." The man's grip tightened on Jake's arm. "My wife. She died 2 years ago. Cancer. It's just been the 3 of us since then." Jake nodded, trying to stay calm while working on the boy's seatbelt. "Okay, but we need to get you all to a hospital." "No." The man coughed, and more blood appeared on his lips. "I'm not going to make it. I can feel it inside. Everything's broken." "Don't talk like that," Jake said, but he could see the truth in the man's eyes. "Promise me," the man whispered. "Promise me you'll take care of them." Jake finally got Ben free and carefully pulled him through the window. The boy immediately started crying and reaching back toward his father, speaking rapidly in what sounded like Chinese. "I don't understand," Jake said to the man while working on the girl's seatbelt. "You need family. Someone who knows them." "There is no one else," the man said. His voice was getting weaker. "My wife's family. They wanted to take the kids away from me after she died. Said I wasn't good enough for them because I'm not Chinese. We were running from them." Jake lifted the girl, Amy, out of the car. She immediately wrapped her arms around her brother, and they both huddled against Jake for warmth. "I can't just take someone else's children," Jake said. The man reached into his jacket pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out a thick envelope. "Everything they need is in here," he said. "Birth certificates, my will, bank information. I named you as their guardian." "You don't even know me," Jake protested. "I know enough." The man's eyes were starting to close. "You stopped. You came down here in this storm to help strangers. Most people would have kept driving." Jake stared at the envelope in the man's blood-stained hand. "Please," the man whispered. "These are my twins. Raise them as your own. They're good kids, smart. Amy loves to draw. Ben loves animals. They deserve a chance at a normal life." The man's hand fell to his side, still clutching the envelope. "Sir?" Jake said. "Sir!" But the man was gone. Jake sat in the snow for a moment, holding two terrified children who were now orphans. The wind continued to howl, and the snow showed no signs of stopping. His truck was a quarter-mile away, and he had no idea what he was supposed to do next. Amy looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for a 6-year-old. "Papa," she whispered. Jake's throat tightened. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. He's gone." Both children began to cry then. Not the loud sobbing of typical kids, but quiet, heartbroken weeping that cut through Jake like a knife. He'd heard that same sound before in places he tried not to remember. "Come on," he said gently, pulling them closer. "We need to get warm." The climb back up to the road was treacherous with two small children, but Jake managed it. He got them into his truck and cranked up the heat, then used his cell phone to call 911. The signal was weak, but he managed to report the accident and give their location. While they waited for help, Jake looked at the children in his rearview mirror. They sat close together, whispering to each other in Chinese. The girl, Amy, still clutched her stuffed rabbit, while Ben kept looking out the back window toward where his father's car lay hidden in the snow. Jake opened the envelope the man had given him. Inside were official documents, a bank statement showing a modest savings account, and a letter written in Chinese characters. There was also a photo of the man with the two children and a beautiful Asian woman who must have been their mother. They all looked happy, like a normal family on a normal day. At the bottom of the envelope was a handwritten note in English. "To whoever finds this, please don't let them be separated. They only have each other now. The money isn't much, but it's all I have. They're American citizens born in San Francisco, Amy Elizabeth Chen and Benjamin David Chen. Thank you for giving them a chance, David Chen." Jake folded the note and put it back in the envelope. Through the windshield, he could see flashing lights in the distance, the ambulance and police cars making their slow way up the mountain road. In a few hours, he'd be back at his ranch, alone like always. But somehow he knew his life had just changed forever, because of two small children and their father's dying wish. Jake Morrison had never felt more out of place than he did sitting in the bright fluorescent lighting of the county social services office. The plastic chair creaked under his weight, and he kept fidgeting with his worn cowboy hat, turning it over and over in his calloused hands. Across from him, Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, shuffled through a stack of papers. "Mr. Morrison," she said, adjusting her reading glasses, "I have to admit this is quite an unusual situation. It had been 3 days since the accident on the mountain road. 3 days since David Chen had died in that overturned car, leaving his 6-year-old twins in Jake's reluctant care. The children were currently in temporary foster care while the state tried to figure out what to do with them. The thing is," Mrs. Patterson continued, "we can't locate any next of kin. Mr. Chen's parents died several years ago, and his wife's family." She paused, consulting her notes. "Well, there seems to be some kind of legal dispute there." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "What kind of dispute?" "According to the documents you provided, Mr. Chen had a restraining order against his late wife's parents. Apparently they had been trying to gain custody of the children, claiming Mr. Chen was an unfit father. But he seemed like a good father," Jake said. "I mean, from what I could tell in those few minutes." Mrs. Patterson nodded. "The children certainly seem well cared for. They're clean, healthy, and clearly loved. But here's the problem. Mr. Chen named you as their guardian in his will, but you two had never met before that night, correct?" "That's right. Courts don't usually honor guardianship requests like that. It's highly irregular." Jake felt a knot forming in his stomach. "So what happens to them?" "Well, we're still trying to contact the maternal grandparents. If they're willing to drop their previous legal challenges and can prove they can provide a stable home. And if they're not," Mrs. Patterson's expression grew sad, "then Amy and Ben will likely be placed in the foster care system. Separately, most likely. It's hard to find families willing to take on twins, especially older children who've experienced trauma." The word "separately" hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He remembered how tightly the children had held on to each other that night in the snow, how Amy had whispered to Ben in Chinese to comfort him. "How long do they have to decide?" Jake asked. "We'll give the grandparents 2 weeks to respond to our inquiries. If we don't hear anything by then..." Jake stood up abruptly. "I want to see them." Mrs. Patterson looked surprised. "The children?" "Yeah, where are they staying?" "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your concern, but you're not family. There are rules about it. Their father asked me to take care of them, Jake interrupted. That has to count for something. Mrs. Patterson studied him carefully. Can I ask you something? Why do you care what happens to these children? You said yourself you'd never met them before. Jake was quiet for a long moment. How could he explain the way Amy had looked at him with those serious dark eyes? Or the way Ben had stopped crying when Jake had wrapped him in his old jacket? How could he describe the feeling he'd had when he'd held that photograph of their happy family, knowing it was all gone now? I don't know, he finally admitted. I just do, Mrs. Patterson softened. Mr. Morrison, raising children is a huge responsibility. It's expensive, it's exhausting, and it changes every aspect of your life. These aren't puppies you can return if it doesn't work out. I know that, do you? You live alone on a cattle ranch. Have you ever taken care of children before? Jake thought about his younger sister, who'd died in the same car accident that had taken his parents when he was 19. He'd been her guardian for exactly 6 months before losing her, too. No, he said quietly. The children will need counseling, special attention. They speak English, but Chinese is their first language. Amy hasn't spoken a word since the accident, and Ben only talks to her. They're traumatized, Mr. Morrison. They need stability, patience, and probably professional help. Jake put his hat back on. Can I see them or not? Mrs. Patterson sighed and picked up her phone. After a brief conversation, she hung up and looked at Jake. The foster family they're with is very understanding. You can visit for an hour, but only if the children want to see you. An hour later, Jake found himself standing on the front porch of a modest house in town. Mrs. Rodriguez, the foster mother, was a plump woman in her 40s who greeted him with a warm smile. You must be the cowboy, she said. The children have been asking about you. They have? Oh, yes. Ben keeps asking where the big man is, and Amy drew this. Mrs. Rodriguez showed Jake a piece of paper. In colorful crayon, a little girl had drawn 3 stick figures standing next to a truck in the snow. One figure was much taller than the other 2. Jake's throat tightened. Where are they? In the backyard. They spend most of their time outside. I think being in the house reminds them too much of... She trailed off. Jake found the children sitting under a large oak tree. Ben was throwing a tennis ball against the house while Amy watched clouds drift across the sky. When they saw Jake approaching, Ben immediately ran to him. You came back, the boy said in accented English. Amy approached more slowly, still clutching the same stuffed rabbit from the accident. Hi there, Jake said, kneeling down to their level. Amy studied his face carefully, then said something to Ben in Chinese. Ben nodded and translated. She wants to know if you're going to take us away from here. Jake looked into Amy's serious eyes. I don't know yet, sweetheart. Would you want me to? Amy whispered something else to Ben. She says you have kind eyes like Papa did, and she wants to know if you have horses. Jake couldn't help but smile. I do have horses and cows. And a couple of dogs. Ben's eyes lit up. Real horses? Can we ride them? Maybe someday, if you're not afraid. Amy finally spoke directly to Jake, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you going to leave us like everyone else? The question hit Jake harder than he'd expected. He looked at these 2 small children who'd lost everything, and he realized that Mrs. Patterson was right. He had no idea what he was getting into. He was a middle-aged bachelor who lived alone on a struggling ranch. He knew nothing about raising kids, especially traumatized ones, but he also knew what it felt like to lose everyone you loved in an instant. No, he heard himself say, I'm not going to leave you. Amy stepped closer and, without warning, wrapped her small arms around his neck. Promise? She whispered. Jake looked over her head at Ben, who was watching them with hopeful eyes. He thought about his empty house, his quiet dinners, his solitary life that had suited him just fine until 3 days ago. I promise, he said. When the hour was up and Jake had to leave, both children cried. But this time their tears seemed different. Not the hopeless grief from the night of the accident, but the desperate sadness of children who'd found hope and were terrified of losing it again. That evening, Jake sat at his kitchen table with David Chen's envelope spread out before him. The bank statement showed about $15,000, enough to cover immediate expenses for a while, but not much more. The children's birth certificates confirmed they were American citizens. There was also a life insurance policy naming the children as beneficiaries, but it wouldn't pay out for months. Jake did some quick math on the back of an envelope. His ranch barely broke even most years. Adding 2 children to his expenses would mean working longer hours, maybe taking on extra jobs in town. Then he thought about Amy's drawing and Ben's excitement about the horses, and the way Amy had hugged him like he was the only solid thing left in her world. The next morning, Jake was back in Mrs. Patterson's office. "I want to file for temporary custody," he said. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her computer screen. "Mr. Morrison, I thought we discussed this." "The children need each other," Jake interrupted. "And they need someone who won't give up on them. I can provide that, but you have no experience. I'll learn. I'll get help. I'll do whatever it takes." Mrs. Patterson studied him for a long moment. "This won't be easy. There will be background checks, home inspections, court hearings. And if the maternal grandparents come forward with a custody claim, we'll deal with that when it happens." "Why are you really doing this, Mr. Morrison?" Jake thought about David Chen's last words, about the promise he'd made to a dying man. But mostly, he thought about 2 little kids who'd already lost too much. "Because they asked me not to leave them," he said simply. Mrs. Patterson picked up her pen and pulled out a form. "All right then," she said. "Let's get started." Jake's ranch house had been quiet for so long that the sound of children's voices echoing through the halls felt like music from another planet. It had been 2 weeks since Amy and Ben had come to live with him, and Jake was beginning to understand why people said parenting was the hardest job in the world. The first morning had been a disaster. Jake woke up at 5:30 like always, made his usual pot of black coffee, and headed out to feed the cattle. He was halfway to the barn when he heard screaming from inside the house. He ran back to find both children in the hallway crying and calling out in Chinese. Amy was shaking Ben's shoulders, trying to wake him up from what must have been a nightmare. When they saw Jake, their faces showed pure panic. "We thought you left us," Ben sobbed in English. Jake knelt down and pulled them both close. "I'm not going anywhere. I just went to feed the animals. I do that every morning." "Without saying goodbye?" Amy asked, her voice tiny. Jake realized he had a lot to learn about having children in his life. From that day forward, Jake made sure to tell Amy and Ben where he was going and when he'd be back, even if it was just to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. The language barrier was harder than Jake had expected. Both children spoke English well, but when they were upset or excited, they switched to Chinese. And when they talked to each other, which was constantly, it was always in rapid Chinese that Jake couldn't understand. 3 days after they'd moved in, Jake drove into town and bought a Chinese-English dictionary and some children's books in both languages. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with Amy and Ben, pointing to pictures and learning basic words. "Horse," Jake said, pointing to a picture. "Ma," Amy said in Chinese, then added, "But in English, horse, ma," Jake repeated badly. Ben giggled. "You sound funny." By the end of their first week together, Jake had learned to say, "Good morning," "Are you hungry?" and "Time for bed" in Chinese. The children seemed delighted by his terrible pronunciation, but they patiently corrected him every time. The nightmares were the worst part. Almost every night, one or both children would wake up crying. Sometimes they called for their father, sometimes their mother, sometimes they just cried without words. Jake had never been good at comforting people, but he learned to sit with them in the dark, rubbing their backs and humming old songs his own mother had sung to him years ago. Gradually, the nightmares became less frequent. Getting them enrolled in the local elementary school took almost a week of paperwork and meetings. The principal, Mrs. Anderson, was a stern woman in her 60s who looked at Jake with obvious skepticism. "Mr. Morrison," she said, reviewing the custody documents, "these children have been through significant trauma. They may need special accommodations." "What kind of accommodations?" "Counseling services, possibly. And they may struggle academically while they adjust. First-grade classes here are taught only in English." Jake felt a familiar knot in his stomach. "But they speak English." "Yes, but academic English is different from conversational English, and trauma can affect a child's ability to concentrate and learn." That night, Jake helped Amy and Ben practice writing their names in English letters. Amy caught on quickly, but Ben struggled, getting frustrated and throwing his pencil across the room. "It's too hard," he said, switching to Chinese. Amy spoke to him softly in Chinese, then turned to Jake. "He says the letters look wrong. In Chinese, his name looks different." Jake picked up the pencil and sat down next to Ben. "You know what? It took me years to learn to write good. And I bet Chinese writing is way harder than English. Ben looked at him curiously. You think Chinese is hard? Are you kidding? All those little lines and curves? That must take forever to learn. Ben straightened up proudly. I can write my name in Chinese. Want to see? He grabbed the pencil and carefully drew several Chinese characters on the paper. Jake stared at them in amazement. That's incredible, he said honestly. You're way smarter than me. From that night on, Ben was more patient with English writing. Their first day of school was terrifying for everyone involved. Amy and Ben clung to each other at the school entrance, both looking small and lost among the other children. What if nobody likes us? Amy whispered. Jake knelt down to their level. Then those kids don't know how lucky they'd be to have you as friends. When Jake picked them up that afternoon, Ben was chattering excitedly in English. There's a boy named Tommy who likes horses too. And the teacher, Miss Johnson, she's really nice. She let me draw a picture of our ranch. Amy was quieter, but she showed Jake a gold star sticker on her hand. I got this for reading, she said shyly. That's wonderful, sweetheart. That evening, Amy sat at the kitchen table drawing while Ben helped Jake prepare dinner, which mostly meant standing on a chair and stirring things while Jake did the actual cooking. Jake, Amy said suddenly. Yeah? Can I call you something else? Jake's heart skipped. What do you mean? Amy put down her crayon and looked at him seriously. The other kids at school, they call their dads Daddy or Papa. But Papa was my real daddy. I don't want to forget him. Jake sat down across from her. You should never forget your Papa. He loved you very much. But what should I call you? Jake thought for a moment. What would feel right to you? Amy considered this. Maybe Uncle Jake? Like your Papa's brother, even though you're not? I'd be honored to be your Uncle Jake. Ben looked up from his stirring. Can I call you Uncle Jake too? Of course, that night, as Jake tucked them into their beds, twin beds he'd bought and assembled himself, Amy gave him a drawing she'd been working on. It's our family, she explained. The drawing showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a house with horses in the background, but this time she'd added details. The tall figure had a cowboy hat. The smaller figures had black hair, and everyone was smiling. It's perfect, Jake said. Over the following weeks, they developed routines. Every morning, Jake woke the children at 7, made them breakfast, which was usually cereal or toast since his cooking skills were limited, and drove them to school. After school, they'd do homework at the kitchen table while Jake worked on ranch paperwork. Evenings were for baths, stories, and the gradual process of convincing 2 energetic 6-year-olds that it was time to sleep. Jake had never realized how much stuff children needed. Clothes, school supplies, lunchboxes, backpacks, shoes that seemed to outgrow their feet every month. His credit card took a beating, but seeing Amy and Ben starting to smile and laugh made every expense worth it. The breakthrough came on a Saturday morning in their 4th week together. Jake was in the barn milking his 1 dairy cow when he heard footsteps behind him. Uncle Jake? Ben's voice was hesitant. What is it, buddy? Can Amy and I help you with the ranch work? Jake looked up to see both children standing in the barn doorway, still in their pajamas but with their boots on. You want to help with chores? Amy nodded eagerly. We want to learn about the animals. Jake showed them how to scatter feed for the chickens, how to fill water troughs, and how to brush the gentler horses. Both children were fearless around the animals, even the large cattle that made most adults nervous. In China, Mama's family had a farm, Amy explained as she carefully brushed an old mare named Belle. Mama told us stories about it, but we never saw it. Would you like to see pictures of China sometime? Jake asked. You have pictures? We can find some at the library, and maybe we can learn more about your Mama's family. That afternoon, they drove to the town library. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, who was also Chinese American, was delighted to meet Amy and Ben. She showed them books about Chinese culture, taught them a few words Jake had been pronouncing wrong, and helped them find information about their mother's home province. Your mama came from a beautiful place, Mrs. Chen told them, showing them pictures of terraced rice fields and ancient temples. On the drive home, Amy was unusually quiet. What are you thinking about, sweetheart? Jake asked. I wish Mama and Papa could see us now, she said. I think they'd be happy that we found you. Jake's eyes got a little misty. I think they would be too. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset, Ben climbed into Jake's lap. Uncle Jake? Yeah? Are we going to stay here forever? Jake looked out at the ranch land stretching toward the mountains, then down at Amy, who was leaning against his chair. Would you like to stay forever? Yes, both children said at the same time. Then forever it is, Jake said. For the first time since the accident, he really believed it might be possible. 2 months after Amy and Ben had come to live with him, Jake finally worked up the courage to take David Chen's letter to someone who could translate it. Mrs. Chen at the library had offered several times, but Jake had always made excuses. Something about reading a dead man's final words felt too personal, too private. But when Ben asked him for the third time that week what his papa had written, Jake knew it was time. Mrs. Chen invited them to her house on a Sunday afternoon. She was a gentlewoman in her 70s who had immigrated from Taiwan 50 years earlier. Her living room was filled with beautiful Chinese artwork and photographs of her own grandchildren. Are you sure you want the children to hear this? She asked Jake quietly while Amy and Ben played with her cat in the next room. They have a right to know what their father said. Mrs. Chen nodded and carefully unfolded the letter. It was written on hotel stationery in neat handwriting. He starts by saying the date. It was written the morning of the accident, she began. Then he writes, to the person who finds this letter, my name is David Chen. If you are reading this, something has happened to me, and my children are alone. Jake felt his throat tighten. Mrs. Chen continued, he says Amy and Ben are everything to me. Their mother, my beloved wife Lisa, died of cancer when they were 4 years old. Since then, it has been just the three of us against the world. Can we hear too? Amy's voice came from the doorway. Jake looked at Mrs. Chen, who nodded. Come sit with us. Both children climbed onto the couch next to Jake. Mrs. Chen resumed reading in English. Your papa writes about how proud he is of both of you. He says Amy has her mother's artistic talent and Ben has the kindest heart he's ever known. Amy leaned closer to Jake. What else does it say? Mrs. Chen's expression grew more serious. He explains why you were traveling that day. He says your mama's parents, your grandparents, had been trying to take you away from him. Why? Ben asked. Mrs. Chen looked at Jake, who nodded for her to continue. Your papa says they believed he couldn't raise you properly because he wasn't Chinese. They thought you should only speak Chinese and live with Chinese families. But Papa was teaching us about Mama's culture, Amy said. He bought us Chinese books and taught us to use chopsticks. I know, sweetie, Mrs. Chen said gently. Some people have strong opinions about these things. Your papa says in the letter that he was taking you somewhere safe where you could grow up without fear. Jake felt anger rising in his chest. These children had lost their parents, and their own family had made their father so afraid that he'd been running away when he died. Mrs. Chen continued reading. He writes, if something happens to me, please don't let my children go to their maternal grandparents. They are not bad people, but they would separate Amy and Ben from everything American in their lives, including their memories of Lisa and me together. The letter went on to describe David's hopes for his children's future. He wanted Amy to continue drawing and maybe become an artist someday. He wanted Ben to learn about animals and nature. He wanted both of them to be proud of their Chinese heritage while still feeling fully American. At the end, Mrs. Chen said, wiping her eyes, he writes, to whoever takes care of my children, please love them as much as I do. They are the best part of me and Lisa. Help them remember us, but don't let grief hold them back from happiness. Thank you for giving them the chance at a normal childhood that Lisa and I always wanted for them. The room was quiet for several minutes. Amy was crying silently and Ben had buried his face in Jake's shirt. He really loved you both, Jake said finally. Do you think he knew you would find us? Amy asked. Jake thought about that night in the snow, about David Chen's desperate eyes and the strength in his grip despite his injuries. I think he hoped someone good would find you, someone who would understand how special you are. That evening, after the children were in bed, Jake called Mrs. Patterson at Social Services. I need to know more about the grandparents, he said. Mr. Morrison, they haven't made contact. It's been 2 months, but they're still out there. What if they change their minds? What if they come looking for the kids? Mrs. Patterson sighed. The restraining order your friend David had against them expired when he died. Legally, they could petition for custody if they wanted to. Jake felt sick. And they'd probably win, right? Because they're blood relatives? Not necessarily. The children have been with you for 2 months now. They're settled, doing well in school, clearly bonded with you. A court would consider what's in their best interests. But it would be a fight. Yes, it would be a fight. The next day, Jake decided to do some investigating of his own. He drove to the county courthouse and spent hours going through public records, trying to learn more about David Chen's life. What he found painted a picture of a man who had struggled but never given up. David had worked as an engineer for a local manufacturing company. He'd bought a modest house in a good school district. He'd volunteered at his children's preschool and donated regularly to children's charities. There were also records of the legal battles with his in-laws. The maternal grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Wang, lived in California. They were wealthy, educated people who had hired expensive lawyers to challenge David's custody of his own children. According to the court documents, they had argued that David was culturally unqualified to raise Chinese American children and that Amy and Ben would be better served by a traditional Chinese household. David had fought them for over a year, spending money he didn't have on legal fees. The restraining order had been granted just 3 months before his death, after Mrs. Wang had tried to take the children from their daycare without David's permission. Jake drove home feeling even more protective of Amy and Ben. That evening, he watched them doing homework at the kitchen table, Amy working on a book report, Ben practicing math problems, and he couldn't imagine anyone thinking these children would be better off anywhere else. "Uncle Jake?" Amy said, looking up from her paper. "What is it, sweetheart? If someone tried to take us away from here, would you fight for us?" Jake's heart clenched. "Why would you ask that?" "I heard you on the phone last night. You sounded worried." Jake sat down at the table with them. He'd learned that honesty, delivered gently, was always better than trying to hide things from children who had already experienced too much uncertainty. "There might be some people who think you should live somewhere else," he said carefully. Ben looked scared. "Who?" "Your mama's parents. But listen to me." Jake reached for both their hands. "No matter what happens, I will always fight for you. You belong here with me on this ranch. This is your home now. Promise?" Amy asked. "I promise." 2 weeks later, Jake's worst fears came true. He was fixing a fence in the far pasture when he saw a black sedan pulling up the driveway. Through the dust cloud it kicked up, he could make out 2 people in the front seat. By the time Jake reached the house, Amy and Ben were already hiding behind the front door. They'd gotten off the school bus and found 2 strangers waiting on their porch. The visitors were an elderly Chinese couple, both well-dressed and formal-looking. The woman was tiny and elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. The man was tall for his age, wearing an expensive suit despite the rural setting. "Mr. Morrison?" The man's English was precise but heavily accented. "I am Mr. Wang. This is my wife. We are the grandparents of Amy and Ben Chen." Jake felt his muscles tense. "They're not expecting you." Mrs. Wang stepped forward. "We have come to see our grandchildren. It has been too long." "There's a reason for that," Jake said firmly. "We know about the troubles with David," Mr. Wang said. "But David is gone now. These children belong with their family." "They are with their family," Jake replied. Mrs. Wang's eyes flashed. "You are not their family. You are a stranger who took advantage of a tragic situation." Jake felt his temper rising, but before he could respond, Amy appeared in the doorway. "We don't want to go with you," she said in English, then repeated something in Chinese. Mrs. Wang answered rapidly in Chinese, her voice getting louder. Amy shook her head and backed toward Jake. "She says we have to come live with them," Amy translated. "She says it's not right for Chinese children to live with American families." "What did you tell her?" Jake asked. "I told her you're our family now, and that Papa said we should stay together." Mr. Wang spoke to his wife in Chinese, then turned back to Jake. "We do not wish to fight," he said, "but these children need proper guidance in their heritage. They need to learn respect for their elders and their culture." "They're learning about their culture," Jake said, "and they're learning to be proud Americans too, just like their parents wanted." Mrs. Wang said something sharp in Chinese. Amy's face crumpled and she ran to Jake. "What did she say?" Jake asked, putting his arm around Amy. She said Papa was foolish and that we're being raised like wild animals." That was the last straw for Jake. "Get off my property," he said, his voice deadly quiet. Mr. Wang straightened. "We will be back. With lawyers. You do that, and I'll be ready for you." As the black sedan disappeared down the driveway, Jake held both children close. They were shaking and Ben was crying quietly. "Are they going to make us go with them?" Ben asked. Jake looked down at these two children who had become the center of his world. In 4 months. 6 months had passed since that snowy night when Jake's life changed forever, and the transformation was remarkable. What had once been a quiet bachelor's ranch now buzzed with the constant activity of two energetic children who had made every corner of the property their own. The old ranch house looked completely different. Amy's artwork covered the refrigerator and most of the kitchen walls. Colorful drawings of horses, family portraits, and elaborate scenes from the Chinese folk tales Mrs. Chen had been teaching them at the library. Ben's collection of interesting rocks, feathers, and other treasures from their daily adventures filled mason jars on every windowsill. Jake had converted the spare bedroom into proper rooms for the children. Amy's room was painted soft yellow with white curtains she'd helped pick out at the store in town. Her desk was covered with art supplies, and she'd hung a mobile made of paper cranes that Mrs. Chen had taught her to fold. Ben's room was blue with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. His bookshelf held a growing collection of books about animals, and his prized possession was a terrarium where he raised crickets to feed the ranch cats. The morning routine that had once been chaos was now smooth and comfortable. Jake woke up at 6:30 instead of his old 5:30, giving himself time to make a real breakfast for the children. Amy preferred pancakes with strawberries, while Ben liked scrambled eggs with cheese. They'd all learned to work around each other in the small kitchen, with Jake doing the cooking while Amy set the table and Ben fed the cats. "Uncle Jake," Amy said one morning while buttering her pancakes, "Tommy's mom wants to know if you want to come to his birthday party next weekend." Jake looked up from packing their lunchboxes. Tommy was Ben's best friend at school, a boy who shared Ben's fascination with bugs and small animals. "Do you want me to come?" Jake asked. "Yes," both children said at the same time. The idea of socializing with other parents still made Jake nervous. Most of the other families at school had been polite but distant when they learned about Jake's unusual situation. Some were curious, others seemed skeptical that a single man could properly raise two young children. But Mrs. Johnson, their teacher, had been incredibly supportive. She'd even arranged for Jake to have lunch with Amy and Ben at school one day, which had made them both glow with pride. "Look, that's our Uncle Jake," Amy had announced to anyone who would listen. Their English had improved dramatically, though they still spoke Chinese to each other when they thought adults weren't listening. Jake had continued learning basic Chinese phrases, and he'd even convinced Mrs. Chen to give him weekly lessons at the library. The children's nightmares had become rare. Instead of waking up crying, they occasionally came to Jake's room just wanting to climb into bed with him for comfort. Jake had bought a bigger bed to accommodate these midnight visits. "Uncle Jake," Ben would whisper. "I had a dream about Papa, but it was a good dream this time." School had become a source of pride for both children. Amy's artistic talents had caught the attention of the art teacher, who'd entered one of her drawings in a regional contest. Ben had become the class expert on ranch animals, frequently bringing photos of their horses and cattle for show and tell. But it was their relationship with the animals that truly showed how much they'd grown. Both children had lost their initial fear and developed genuine partnerships with the ranch creatures. Amy had claimed a gentle mare named Daisy as her own special horse. Every afternoon, she'd sit in Daisy's stall and talk to her while brushing her coat. Sometimes Jake would hear her having entire conversations with the horse, telling Daisy about her day at school or her plans for new drawings. Ben had become Jake's unofficial assistant with the cattle. The boy had a natural gift for reading animal behavior, often noticing when a cow was sick or injured before Jake did. He'd appointed himself protector of the ranch cats, making sure they had fresh water and warm places to sleep. "Uncle Jake," Ben said one evening as they walked back from the barn, "do you think animals can understand love?" Jake looked down at this serious 6-year-old who spent his free time caring for creatures that most kids his age barely noticed. "I think they can," Jake said. "Why do you ask?" "Because when I talk to the cows, they seem to listen, and when Amy hugs Daisy, Daisy gets really calm and happy." "I think you're right, buddy. Animals are pretty smart about feelings." The financial challenges hadn't disappeared, but Jake was managing. David Chen's life insurance had finally come through, providing a college fund for the children and helping with immediate expenses. Jake had also started taking on weekend jobs in town, fixing fences for other ranchers, helping with hay harvests, anything that brought in extra money without taking him away from Amy and Ben during school hours. Mrs. Rodriguez from Social Services visited once a month, and her reports were consistently positive. The children were thriving academically, socially, and emotionally. Their counselor at school had gradually reduced their sessions from weekly to monthly to occasional check-ins. Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Rodriguez had said during her last visit, "I have to tell you, this is one of the most successful guardian placements I've seen. Those children adore you, and it's obvious you adore them." "They're easy kids to love," Jake had replied. "Not all children who've experienced trauma are easy to love. Amy and Ben are thriving because you've given them exactly what they needed: stability, patience, and unconditional acceptance." The community had gradually warmed up to their unusual family. The local diner owner, Pete, always made sure to have chocolate milk ready when Jake brought the children in for their monthly dinner out. The pharmacist's wife had started including small toys in their bag when Jake filled prescriptions. Even the gruff old man who ran the feed store had softened, always finding excuses to give Amy and Ben small gifts like colorful horse brushes or interesting rocks for Ben's collection. But it was the children themselves who showed the most dramatic change. Amy had grown from the silent, frightened little girl clinging to her stuffed rabbit into a confident child who raised her hand eagerly in class and made friends easily. Her drawings had evolved from simple stick figures to complex, detailed scenes that told stories. Ben had transformed from a scared boy who barely spoke English into a chatterbox who could talk for hours about his favorite subjects: animals, rocks, stars, and anything else that caught his scientific mind. His teachers said he had the curiosity of a natural researcher. Most importantly, both children had learned to laugh again. Not the polite, careful laughter of traumatized children, but the genuine, joyous giggles of kids who felt safe and loved. "Uncle Jake," Amy said one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset, "do you think Mama and Papa can see us from heaven?" Jake had learned to answer these questions honestly but gently. "I hope so, sweetheart. What do you think they'd say if they could see you now?" Amy considered this seriously. "I think Papa would be proud that we learned to ride horses. And Mama would like my drawings. I think they'd be proud that you've grown into such wonderful, kind children," Jake said. Ben climbed into Jake's lap, something that still made Jake's heart melt every time. "Uncle Jake?" "Yeah, buddy. When I grow up, I want to be a rancher like you." "You do?" "Yeah. And I want to take care of animals and help kids who don't have families." Amy nodded enthusiastically. "And I want to draw pictures of all the animals on our ranch. Maybe I could make a book." Jake looked at these two children who had filled his life with purpose and joy, and he realized that David Chen's dying wish had become the greatest gift anyone had ever given him. "I think those are wonderful dreams," he said, "and I think we have plenty of time to make them come true." As the stars came out over the ranch, the three of them sat together in comfortable silence, watching the horses graze in the pasture and listening to the gentle sounds of their animals settling in for the night. For the first time since that snowy evening 6 months ago, Jake allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, their story was going to have a happy ending. He was about to learn that happiness was something you had to fight for. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 7 months after Jake had first found Amy and Ben in that overturned car. Jake was making breakfast when he heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, he watched a man in a suit get out of an expensive sedan and walk toward the house with an official-looking envelope. Amy and Ben were still getting dressed for school, their cheerful voices echoing from upstairs as they debated whether Ben should wear his dinosaur shirt or his cowboy shirt. They had no idea that their world was about to be turned upside down again. Jake signed for the papers with a sinking heart. He'd been expecting this ever since Mr. and Mrs. Wang had shown up at the ranch 2 months earlier. But that didn't make it any easier to read the legal language that essentially said he wasn't good enough to be Amy and Ben's guardian. The petition for custody was filed by Liu Wei Wang and Susan Wang, Amy and Ben's maternal grandparents. Their expensive lawyers had prepared a thick document that painted Jake as an unfit guardian and argued that the children belonged with their proper family. Jake sat at the kitchen table, reading through the accusations with growing anger. According to the Wang's lawyers, Jake was an unmarried man with no child-rearing experience who was culturally inappropriate to raise Chinese-American children. They claimed that Amy and Ben were being denied their cultural heritage and raised in an unsuitable environment. Uncle Jake? Amy's voice came from the stairs. We're ready for school. Jake quickly folded the papers and stuffed them back in the envelope. He'd have to call Mrs. Patterson and probably find a lawyer, but first he needed to get the children safely to school and figure out how to explain this to them. Coming, he called back, forcing his voice to sound normal. During the drive to school, Ben chattered excitedly about a project he was doing on farm animals, while Amy talked about the Halloween costume she was planning. They were so happy, so settled, so completely unaware that someone was trying to take them away from the only stable home they'd known since their father's death. After dropping them off, Jake drove straight to the social services office. I've been expecting this, Mrs. Patterson said when Jake showed her the custody petition. The Wangs hired a very expensive law firm in Los Angeles. What does this mean for Amy and Ben? Mrs. Patterson studied the documents. It means we're going to court. The judge will have to decide what's in the children's best interests. And what are our chances? Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment. Jake, I'm going to be honest with you. The Wangs have some advantages. They're the children's biological family. They're wealthy. They can provide private schools, college funds, cultural experiences. And they're married. Jake felt his stomach drop. But the children are happy here. They're thriving. I know that. You know that. But we're going to have to prove it to a judge who doesn't know Amy and Ben, and who might be influenced by the idea that children should be with blood relatives whenever possible. That evening, after helping Amy and Ben with their homework and getting them ready for bed, Jake sat them down at the kitchen table. He'd spent all day trying to figure out how to explain the situation without terrifying them. Remember your mama's parents who came to visit a couple of months ago? He began. Both children nodded, their faces immediately growing serious. Well, they've asked a judge to decide if you should come live with them instead of staying here with me. Amy's eyes filled with tears. But we don't want to live with them. We want to stay here. I know, sweetheart. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that happens. Ben climbed onto Jake's lap. What if the judge says we have to go? Jake held him close. Then we'll tell the judge why you belong here. We'll show him how happy you are, how well you're doing in school, how much you love the animals in this ranch. Will we get to talk to the judge? Amy asked. Probably. And you can tell him exactly how you feel. That night, both children ended up in Jake's bed, huddled against him like they hadn't done in months. Jake lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was about to lose the two most important people in his life. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, social workers, and child psychologists. Jake had found a family lawyer named Tom Bradley, a man in his 50s who specialized in custody cases. Tom was kind but realistic about their challenges. The fact that you're unmarried hurts us, Tom explained during their first meeting. Family courts still have a bias toward two-parent households. But David Chen was a single parent, Jake protested. David Chen was their biological father. That's different. Tom reviewed all of Jake's documentation, the temporary custody orders, the social services reports, the children's school records, medical records, everything that showed Amy and Ben were thriving in his care. The good news is that the children are clearly doing well, Tom said. Their grades are excellent, their teachers rave about them, and their counselor says they're emotionally healthy and well-adjusted. What's the bad news? The Wang's lawyers are going to argue that they can provide better opportunities. Private schools, tutors, cultural education, college funds. They're also going to question whether a cattle rancher can provide appropriate guidance for gifted children. Gifted children? Tom showed Jake a report the Wangs had commissioned. They had Amy and Ben tested by a child psychologist. Both children scored in the gifted range for intelligence and creativity. Jake felt a surge of pride mixed with worry. Is that bad for us? It gives them ammunition to argue that the children need more sophisticated educational opportunities than a rural school can provide. The custody evaluation process was grueling. A court-appointed social worker named Dr. Martinez spent hours interviewing Jake, Amy, Ben, their teachers, neighbors, and anyone else who knew their family situation. She visited the ranch multiple times, observing how Jake and the children interacted. Dr. Martinez was a professional woman in her 40s who maintained careful neutrality throughout the process. She asked probing questions about Jake's background, his parenting philosophy, his plans for the children's education and cultural development. Mr. Morrison, she said during one interview, how do you plan to help Amy and Ben maintain their connection to their Chinese heritage? Jake had prepared for this question. We go to the library every week where Mrs. Chen teaches them about Chinese culture and history. I'm learning Chinese myself so I can communicate with them in their first language. We celebrate Chinese holidays and cook Chinese food, but I also think it's important that they feel fully American, which is what their parents wanted. The Wangs argued that you can't provide the deep cultural education they could offer. Maybe not, Jake admitted, but I can give them something else. Unconditional love and a stable home where they don't have to choose between being Chinese and being American. Dr. Martinez also spent considerable time with Amy and Ben, both together and separately. Jake wasn't allowed to be present during these interviews, which made him anxious. What if the children said something that could be misinterpreted? What if they didn't express themselves clearly? His worries were unnecessary. When Dr. Martinez completed her evaluation, she recommended that Amy and Ben remain in Jake's custody. These children have formed a strong, healthy attachment to Mr. Morrison, her report stated. They view him as their father figure and the ranch as their permanent home. While the grandparents could provide certain material advantages, the children's emotional well-being would be severely compromised by removing them from their current placement. But the Wangs weren't giving up. Their lawyers appealed the recommendation and demanded a full court hearing. They're pulling out all the stops, Tom warned Jake. They've hired a child development expert to testify that children should be raised within their ethnic community. They're also bringing in an educational consultant to argue that Amy and Ben aren't being challenged academically. The weeks leading up to the court hearing were the most stressful of Jake's life. Amy and Ben could sense the tension, even though he tried to hide it from them. Amy's artwork became darker and more anxious. Ben started having nightmares again. Uncle Jake, Amy said one evening, are you scared about going to court? Jake considered lying, but he'd learned that honesty was always better with these children who had already experienced too much uncertainty. Yes, he said, I'm scared, but I'm also determined to fight for you because you're my family now. We're scared too, Ben admitted. Jake pulled both children close. You know what? Being scared is okay. It means we care about each other. And sometimes when you care about something enough, being scared makes you stronger. 3 days before the hearing, Jake got unexpected support from an unlikely source. The children's first-grade teacher, Mrs. Johnson, called him at home. Mr. Morrison, she said, I want to testify at the hearing. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do. I've been teaching for 23 years, and I've never seen children more settled and happy than Amy and Ben. Whatever you're doing, it's working. Soon, other people were volunteering to speak on their behalf. Mrs. Chen from the library, Dr. Peterson, the veterinarian who had watched Ben's gentle way with injured animals, Pete from the diner, even some of the other parents from school who had come to respect Jake's dedication to the children. The courthouse was an imposing brick building in the county seat, and Jake felt small walking up its concrete steps on that cold November morning. Amy and Ben walked between him and Tom Bradley, their lawyer. Both children dressed in their best clothes and looking far too serious for 6-year-olds. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to Jake. Despite the shared name, was a woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes. She had a reputation for being fair but no nonsense, someone who didn't tolerate games in her courtroom. The Wangs sat at the opposing table with their team of lawyers. Mrs. Wang wore an expensive black suit and kept dabbing her eyes with a tissue, while Mr. Wang sat rigidly upright, occasionally glancing toward Amy and Ben with an expression that seemed more possessive than loving. This is a custody hearing to determine the best interests of Amy Chen and Ben Chen, Judge Morrison began. I want to remind everyone that we are here to serve these children, not the adults who want them. The Wang's lawyer, a polished woman named Ms. Stevens, went first. She painted a picture of Jake as well-meaning but inadequate, a bachelor rancher who couldn't possibly provide the educational opportunities and cultural guidance that Amy and Ben deserved. Your Honor, Ms. Stevens said, my clients can provide these children with private tutors, cultural immersion programs, and preparation for admission to the finest universities. Mr. Morrison, while undoubtedly caring, can offer none of these advantages. She brought in expert witnesses who testified about the importance of cultural identity in child development, the benefits of two-parent households, and the superior educational resources available to families with substantial financial means. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a child psychologist hired by the Wangs, testified that removing Amy and Ben from Jake's care would cause temporary distress, but that children were remarkably resilient and would adjust quickly to their new environment. These children have been living in a state of cultural deprivation, Dr. Walsh declared. They need to be reconnected with their heritage before it's too late. Jake watched Amy and Ben during this testimony. Amy sat perfectly still, her face pale, while Ben fidgeted nervously with the sleeves of his dress shirt. He wanted to comfort them, but Tom had instructed him to remain composed and professional throughout the proceedings. When it was their turn, Tom called a parade of witnesses who testified about Jake's character and the children's obvious happiness in his care. Mrs. Johnson took the stand first, her voice clear and confident. In 23 years of teaching, I have rarely seen children more secure and well-adjusted than Amy and Ben, she said. They speak proudly of their Uncle Jake and their life on the ranch. Amy's artwork consistently features their family of 3, and Ben frequently includes ranch animals in his school projects because he's genuinely excited about his life there. Mrs. Chen, from the library, testified about the cultural education Jake had, ensured the children received. Mr. Morrison brings Amy and Ben to Chinese cultural events at the library every month, she said. He's learning Mandarin himself to better communicate with them. These children are proud of their Chinese heritage, but they're also proud to be Americans living on a ranch in Montana. Dr. Martinez, the court-appointed evaluator, gave her professional assessment. These children have formed a primary attachment to Mr. Morrison, she testified. Removing them from his care would constitute a significant trauma. While the grandparents could provide material advantages, the children's emotional well-being would be severely compromised by separation from their current guardian. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Jake had been worried about how the children would handle testifying, but Tom had assured him that Judge Morrison was experienced in interviewing young witnesses. When Amy was called to the stand, she walked to the witness chair with remarkable composure for a 6-year-old. Judge Morrison leaned forward and spoke to her gently. Amy, I know this is scary, but I just want to ask you a few questions. There are no wrong answers, okay? Amy nodded. Can you tell me about your life with Mr. Morrison? Amy's face lit up. Uncle Jake takes really good care of us. He makes us breakfast every morning, and he helps with our homework, and he taught me how to brush Daisy. That's my horse. Well, she's not really mine, but Uncle Jake says she's my special friend. Do you miss your papa and mama? Amy's expression grew sad but not frightened. I miss them every day, but Uncle Jake helps us remember them. He has pictures of them in our rooms, and he lets us talk about them whenever we want. He says Mama and Papa would be proud of how we're growing up. Amy, your grandparents want you to come live with them. How do you feel about that? Amy was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at her grandparents. I know they think they love us, she said carefully, but they don't know us. They don't know that I like to draw pictures of our ranch, or that Ben is afraid of thunderstorms but loves baby calves. Uncle Jake knows everything about us, Judge Morrison nodded. Is there anything else you want to tell me? Amy turned back to face the judge. Uncle Jake is our real family now. Not because he's our blood, but because he chose to love us when we had nobody else. He promised Papa he would take care of us, and he always keeps his promises. When Ben took the stand, he was more nervous than his sister, but equally clear about his feelings. I want to stay with Uncle Jake forever and ever, he said earnestly. He teaches me about the animals, and he reads me stories at bedtime, and when I have bad dreams, he sits with me until I feel better. Judge Morrison asked him about his memories of his parents. Uncle Jake says Mama and Papa are watching us from heaven, Ben said. And I think they're happy that we found Uncle Jake because he takes care of us just like Papa did. Ben, what would you say to your grandparents if you could tell them anything? Ben looked at Mr. and Mrs. Wang with surprising maturity. I would say thank you for loving Mama, but we already have a home, and Uncle Jake needs us too because before we came, he was all alone. The most dramatic moment came when Ms. Stevens, the Wang's lawyer, attempted to cross-examine Amy. Amy, don't you think you'd be happier living in a big house with lots of toys and your own computer? Amy considered this seriously. Maybe for a little while. But then I'd miss Uncle Jake and Daisy and all our animals. And Ben would be sad too. We belong on the ranch. But wouldn't you like to learn more about Chinese culture? Your grandparents could teach you things Mr. Morrison can't. Amy straightened in her chair. Uncle Jake already helps us learn about Mama's culture. But Papa was American and we're American too. We don't want to be just one thing. Ms. Stevens pressed further. Amy, you're very young. Sometimes children don't know what's best for them. That's when Amy surprised everyone in the courtroom. I'm not too young to know that Uncle Jake loves us, she said firmly. And I'm not too young to know that ripping us away from our home would be mean and wrong, Judge Morrison intervened. That's enough, Ms. Stevens. Jake felt a surge of pride watching this brave little girl stand up for their family. The final witness was Jake himself. Tom had prepared him extensively for this moment. But sitting in the witness chair facing Judge Morrison, Jake felt like his entire future depended on the next few minutes. Mr. Morrison, Tom began, can you tell the court why you believe Amy and Ben should remain in your custody? Jake looked at the children, then back at the judge. Your Honor, 8 months ago I was a lonely middle-aged man living by myself on a cattle ranch. I thought I was content with my solitary life. Then I found these 2 children on the worst night of their lives, and their father made me promise to take care of them. Jake paused, gathering his thoughts. I'm not wealthy. I can't provide private schools or fancy tutors. But I can give Amy and Ben something that money can't buy. A home where they're loved unconditionally, where they're safe to be themselves, where they can honor their parents' memory while building their own futures. What makes you think you're qualified to raise these children? Honestly, nothing prepared me for this. I've made mistakes and I'll probably make more. But I love these children like they're my own blood. I've watched Amy blossom from a traumatized little girl into a confident, creative child. I've seen Ben transform from a frightened boy into a curious, compassionate kid who can gentle a spooked horse. Jake's voice grew stronger. These children don't need to be saved from me, Your Honor. They're thriving. They're happy. They're home. Ms. Stevens's cross-examination was aggressive, focusing on Jake's lack of formal education, his modest income, and his unmarried status. But Jake answered every question honestly and calmly. Mr. Morrison, don't you think these children deserve better than a struggling cattle ranch? Jake looked directly at Amy and Ben. I think these children deserve to be loved and valued for who they are, not who someone else thinks they should become. They deserve stability and security and the chance to grow up without fear. If that's not good enough for some people, then those people don't understand what really matters. After closing arguments, Judge Morrison announced that she would render her decision within 1 week. As they left the courthouse, Amy and Ben flanked Jake, each holding one of his hands. Did we do good, Uncle Jake? Ben asked. Jake knelt down and hugged them both. 2 years later, Jake Morrison stood in the same spot where he'd first found David Chen's overturned car, but everything about his world had changed. The memorial stone he'd placed there was now weathered by seasons of mountain storms, and wildflowers had grown up around its base. Amy had insisted on planting them there last spring, saying Papa would like having flowers nearby. The inscription on the stone was simple. David Chen, beloved father. His greatest gift was trusting a stranger with his children's future. Today was the anniversary of that snowy night that had changed 3 lives forever. Jake had brought Amy and Ben here to remember their father and to reflect on how far they'd all come since Judge Morrison had made her decision that cold. November day, the judge's ruling had been decisive and clear. While the court acknowledges that Mr. and Mrs. Wang could provide certain material advantages, she had said, the paramount consideration must be the best interests of these children. Amy and Ben have formed a secure attachment to Mr. Morrison and are thriving in his care. To remove them now would cause significant psychological harm with no corresponding benefit. Jake would never forget the moment when Judge Morrison had announced that he would retain full custody of Amy and Ben, with the option to proceed with formal adoption proceedings. Amy had burst into tears of relief, while Ben had jumped up from his chair and run to hug Jake right there in the courtroom. The Wangs had been devastated, but something unexpected had happened in the months following the trial. Mrs. Wang had approached Jake outside the courthouse after the decision was announced. Mr. Morrison, she had said, her voice trembling with emotion, I want you to know that this was never about taking the children from someone who loves them. We were afraid they would forget their mother, forget where they came from. Jake had looked at this grieving grandmother and seen past the legal battle to the real fear underneath. They'll never forget their mother, he had promised, and they'll never stop being proud of their Chinese heritage. but they're also going to grow up knowing they're loved and wanted exactly as they are. Over time, the Wangs had gradually become part of Amy and Ben's extended family. They visited twice a year now, staying at a hotel in town and spending time getting to know their grandchildren without the pressure of custody disputes. Mrs. Wang had taught Amy to cook traditional Chinese dumplings, while Mr. Wang had been amazed by Ben's knowledge of animal behavior. The adoption had been finalized 6 months after the custody hearing. Amy and Ben had chosen to hyphenate their names, becoming Amy Chen Morrison and Ben Chen Morrison. It was their way of honoring both their past and their future. "We want to keep Papa and Mama's name," Amy had explained to the judge, "but we also want everyone to know we're Uncle Jake's kids too." The ranch itself had been transformed. What had once been a struggling operation run by a solitary bachelor was now a thriving family business. Jake had expanded into offering riding lessons for local children, and Ben's natural way with animals had inspired Jake to start a small program helping kids from town learn about farm life. Amy's artwork had progressed far beyond crayon drawings on the refrigerator. At 8 years old, she had already won several regional art contests, and her paintings of ranch life had been displayed in the county library. But more importantly, her art reflected the happiness and security she'd found in her new life. Gone were the dark, anxious sketches from the early days. Now her work was full of bright colors, smiling faces, and scenes of family life on the ranch. Ben, also 8 now, had become Jake's unofficial partner in running the ranch. The boy had an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that amazed everyone who met him. He could calm a spooked horse with a few soft words and seemed to know instinctively when an animal was sick or injured. The local veterinarian had started bringing Ben along on some of his calls, recognizing the boy's rare gift. The financial struggles that had kept Jake awake at night during those first months had eased considerably. David Chen's life insurance money had been carefully invested for the children's education, while the riding lessons and farm tours had provided steady additional income. More importantly, the community had fully embraced their unusual family. Mrs. Johnson, who had been Amy and Ben's first-grade teacher and had testified so powerfully at their custody hearing, had become like a grandmother to them. Pete from the diner always had their favorite meals ready when they came to town. The local bank president had personally approved Jake's loan to expand the ranch facilities. "You know what I love about small towns?" Jake had said to Tom Bradley, their lawyer who had become a close friend. "Once they accept you, they really accept you. Amy and Ben aren't the adopted Chinese kids anymore. They're just Amy and Ben Morrison, local ranch kids who happen to be brilliant and beautiful." School had become a source of pure joy for both children. Amy was enrolled in advanced art classes and had been selected for the gifted program. Ben was excelling in science and had started a nature club that went on weekly field trips to study local wildlife. Both children were popular with their classmates and had developed the kind of deep, lasting friendships that Jake had worried they might never be capable of after their early trauma. The nightmares had stopped completely by the end of their first year with Jake. Now, instead of midnight crying, Jake was more likely to be awakened by giggles from the children's rooms as they played elaborate games with their toys or whispered about plans for the next day's adventures. "Uncle Jake," Amy had said one morning at breakfast, "do you ever get lonely anymore?" Jake had looked around their kitchen, which was never quiet anymore, with Amy's latest artwork taped to the walls and Ben's collection of interesting rocks covering the windowsills. "Lonely," he had laughed. "I can barely remember what lonely feels like." The truth was that Amy and Ben had filled not just Jake's house, but his heart and his life in ways he never could have imagined. They had taught him that family wasn't about blood or genetics or even legal documents. Family was about choosing each other day after day and building something beautiful together. Now standing by David Chen's memorial stone, Jake watched Amy place fresh flowers while Ben carefully cleaned the inscription. "Do you think Papa knows how happy we are?" Ben asked. Jake looked at these two remarkable children who had grown from traumatized 6-year-olds into confident, loving 8-year-olds who faced each day with curiosity and joy. "I think he knows," Jake said, "and I think he's proud of the people you're becoming." Amy stood up and took Jake's hand. "Do you think he's proud of you too, Uncle Jake?" Jake squeezed her small hand. "I hope so, sweetheart. I really hope so." As they walked back toward the truck, Ben suddenly stopped and pointed toward the sky. "Look," he said excitedly. Above them, two eagles soared in lazy circles, riding the mountain thermals with effortless grace. Amy smiled. "Mama and Papa," she said with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children possess. Jake didn't believe in signs or supernatural messages, but watching those eagles dance in the wind above the spot where David Chen had entrusted him with the most precious things in his life, he felt a profound sense of peace. The drive home was filled with the comfortable chatter of children planning their evening activities. Amy wanted to work on a painting she'd started of their horses in the snow. Ben was excited about a new book about wolves that Mrs. Chen had found for him at the library. As they pulled into the ranch driveway, Jake felt the same sense of homecoming he experienced every time he saw their house with its welcoming lights and the smoke curling up from the chimney. This was home in every sense of the word, not just a place to live, but the center of a real family's life. That evening, as Jake tucked Amy and Ben into their beds, Amy handed him a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "Open it," she said with a shy smile. Inside was one of Amy's detailed drawings, but this one was different from anything she'd created before. It showed 4 stick figures standing together in front of their ranch house. Jake recognized himself, Amy, and Ben, but there was a 4th figure, slightly transparent, standing behind them with his hands on the children's shoulders. At the bottom of the page, Amy had written in her careful 8-year-old handwriting, "Our forever family, Papa. Uncle Jake, Amy, and Ben." Jake felt tears prick his eyes. "Amy, this is beautiful. Papa is still part of our family," she said simply. "He just lives in heaven now instead of with us. But he sent us to you so we'd always be safe and loved." Jake kissed both children goodnight and walked to his own room, carrying Amy's drawing. He placed it on his nightstand next to the photograph of David Chen with his children that he'd kept there since that first night. Looking at both images, David Chen's loving smile and Amy's drawing of their blended family, Jake reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them all together. A dying man's desperate plea on a snowy mountain road had become the foundation of the most beautiful thing in Jake's life. He'd learned that love didn't always come in the packages you expected. Sometimes it arrived in the middle of a storm, wounded and afraid, asking you to be braver and more generous than you ever thought possible. David Chen had asked Jake to raise his children as his own. What David couldn't have known was that in saving Amy and Ben,